Welcome to another episode of Pistis with Us. I'm Raleigh Clay. I'm joined today by Professor of Theological Studies at Dallas Theological Seminary, Dr. Michael Svigel. Dr. Svigel, beyond being a professor, is also an author of both fiction and nonfiction works. And we will talk about one of those works today in more detail. I've been excited about this conversation. I've been looking forward to it. So thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We have a mutual friend who's been trying to get this conversation between you and I to happen for a while. And yeah, it just hasn't.
I'm glad we were able to make it work.
Yeah, especially as I was finishing up my master's thesis, since it was so eschatologically driven. That's a big word. Yes, it is. And don't ask me to say it again right off the cuff. And I might say it different the next time.
That's right.
But yeah, he was really like, you need to talk to Svigel. You need to talk to him about this. That's his area. And but you were on sabbatical at that time, and so yeah, I was like, well,
during
I'm
COVID,
yes. So I was finishing up like right after things started coming back around and everything. So the AI theist.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great title. In fact, like when I first saw it, I was like, is it like a play on atheist?
Yeah.
But the AI, and so that's really interesting. So why this book, and why now? Like, how'd this come about?
So I do write, like, as you mentioned in the intro, I do write nonfiction, which is just normal traditional publishing, and it's books. What my wife says people don't really want to read and won't buy, but the theology and Bible books, things like that. But I also do fiction, and I've done a couple juvenile fantasy books, a sci-fi novel, full length, and I'm working on the sequel to that one. And then this one was kind of in the back of my mind as an idea for a story. I thought, we have so much sci-fi stories, movies, where the AI, the intelligent computer, goes bad. So Matrix and Terminator and classic HAL 9000. I don't know if any of your viewers have seen this one where the computer kind of goes crazy and tries to... So it's all the Frankenstein theme, right? You create this thing, it gets intelligent, it comes back and tries to kill you. And almost never do you see in sci-fi benevolent AI. If so, it's like the Star Trek on shipboard computer, which kind of talks in monotone and it doesn't really do anything, or a comical character like Data in the Next Generation, right?
Short Circuit, something.
Right. So they're not. And I thought, about 5 or 6 years ago, I thought, it'd be kind of cool if you had this sentient AI that got really interested in religious things. In the original version of the story, I kind of thought, well, maybe he gets interested in religious things and obsessing over them, but realizes he's just a computer, can't be saved, he's not human, he doesn't have a soul, and he has all these existential philosophical problems. And so they invite a pastor in to counsel him. And that just kind of sat in the back of my mind, mostly because it wasn't that interesting. The concept was kind of cool. But then with that whole AI thing that has come out in the last year or so, big time, I kind of revived that and brought it back to the front of my mind. I thought, what would it be more interesting? And that is what became the kind of the plot of the book, is if the computer is the believer, becomes convinced that Christianity is true for all kinds of reasons, and then they bring in a former believer, an atheist, and in this case used to be a professor of theology for 20-some years, but lost his faith, and he's coming in and now to try to convince the computer that it's not true. And as soon as I had that kind of dynamic, more the point-counterpoint, frankly, the thing just sort of wrote itself. So, and that's kind of basically the story. Once we introduce Yar, which is the computer, the sentient computer, and Michael Berg, who is the atheist, former theologian turned atheist. The rest is these dialogues and tug of war between these two worldviews. And I thought that was an interesting kind of play.
Yeah, and it really is written as a dialogue really between these two. I mean, there's other characters and other things going on, which was really fascinating to me. And it's honestly the first fiction book that I have read in quite some time. And
did it feel like you were reading fiction?
And that's a lot of what I want to talk about. It brought up so many different theological notions or concepts or doctrines. And I mean, you mentioned just one that we could launch into and have 18 episodes at least and not like really get to the heart of it maybe. But there is this idea of this professor of theological studies, you know, you have the sentient computer who is now, by reason, logic, like all this information is like, well, Christianity just makes sense logically, viewing all the other religions, like all of this kind of stuff, and coming to like what you would say in some sense is faith, or like at least logical faith or something.
Right.
But one of the really interesting things is, and I think a lot of people wrestle and grapple with just the everyday Christian, not even the professor or pastor or teacher of scriptures, is this idea of falling away from the faith.
Sure.
And how that works itself out. And you know, you get the really kind of quaint, well, they weren't really saved.
They never really,
Right.
And
so talk about that a little bit, and not to give away like what's going on completely in the book, but just maybe as a more theological concept, as people who read this book might be going, oh, wait a second, like just off the bat, like red flag or something.
Yeah, and so I'm not giving anything away by saying the main character. In fact, it's written from his perspective, so it's written in the first person in his account of being invited to this interaction with this computer to try to counsel him out of the believing in Christianity. Right on the cover, it says, you know, a theologian turned atheist is coming in to cure this computer of its faith. So that's not a giveaway of anything. No spoilers there. But it brings up the question, you know, well, theologically, where is this person? Even though he's a fictional character, this happens all the time. We know a lot of people.
Right.
I don't know any people who were theologian professors for 20 years that lost the faith. I'm sure they're out there somewhere. But, I mean, people are constantly abandoning the faith, maybe for a different religion, trading it in for something new. But a lot of times they just, you know, they're ex-evangelicals or ex-Christians, or I've even heard of people having unbaptism ceremonies with a hairdryer.
Yeah.
And so what is that? What is their state from a theological perspective? And it is true that there are people, even in Scripture, that weren't really believers or only feigned faith or kind of went along for the benefit of it. But surely, I know people that, man, their testimony, their conversion, it seemed just as genuine. They didn't look like they were faking it. And then they either drift off, or more often than not, something happens. It may be a bunch of somethings that kind of traumatic events or mistreatment or certain things, what we call, you know, church trauma, those kinds of things happen. And you have to, those are real and serious and unfortunate. But sometimes it's a single tragedy that occurs. But that's the funny thing, not funny, haha, but that's a strange thing in that I know my mother and my uncle both faced very similar losses, tragedies in their lives. To the one, it strengthened my mother's faith, and the other one, it basically stripped him of any that he would have had. So people's responses even to those things. So I want to say the things that motivate people to doubt in unbelief, it's complicated. It's not, almost never is it just, oh, I examined all of the facts and concluded that, you know, unbelief is more reasonable than belief. That sometimes happens, but most of the time, there's a lot more going on. And what do we do with them theologically? I am one of these people who prefers to suspend judgment because as long as people are alive, we're still in the middle of their story. And I've seen people come back around and say, oh, you know, I'm coming back. I don't know what that's going to look like, but I'm coming back to something like faith. And so you always have to hold out hope.
Yeah. And I think that's the key, that in the theological debate and in the theological circles of, well, they fell away from the faith and like some of those questions, the hope is not ultimately, if there seems to have been this conversion, like true conversion experience, because I'm with you. I've had incredible friends that I've spent years with praying and like I seem to just know that the Lord had grabbed a hold of them in a real way. To have years later, just like what in the world's going on?
What happened?
And often it is some kind of traumatic thing or some big issue. But with some of my friends, it was just like I just didn't feel it anymore. Like, wow, it wasn't even just a feeling or something like that they had. Like this was a true pursuit. And so when I say the ultimate hope is that they will come back around, and so like this idea of just keep pursuing them as well. And so I think that concept, and when we think about it in terms of theology, we tend to separate it from real life in a lot of sense. Like we do that with a lot of different theology, and we think about it and talk about it on a ethereal level or esoteric level without like really getting into like no, like we're in the dirt of the thing too, and working with real people with real struggles, and so we can't separate those things to where like, well, this is how real life should be just because we have all these great theological ideas, and whether that's from the reformers or like the other guys, this is how we're going to talk about them if they're not our guys. Or
the
whatever.
3 views of why people fall away and what they're, here's these 3 views and the bullet point 1, bullet point 2, and which one does Jan fit in? And well, that's so clinical,
Right.
And then you talk to Jan, it's like, no, it's much more complicated.
Yes.
Much more complicated. And I think we have to realize that. And that's one thing I try to point out is that there are in the book, in the story of these, especially these 2 characters, and even to a degree, one of the third main characters, kind of the Elon Musk sort of guy. In the story is Ramesh Ray, who's the owner, I guess, inventor of Yar. He also has a kind. He's more agnostic, and he has a role to play in there. And I try to point out that look, the things that motivate faith, belief, as well as the unbelief, are complicated. Yes, they're about facts, but I think I show that, facts can be interpreted in different ways. And just because something doesn't seem reasonable or likely doesn't mean it's not true.
Right.
And just because something seems likely doesn't mean it's true. It's complicated. Things are complicated. And so we're motivated by a number of different factors. So I have a lot of compassion for people who slip away, fall away, especially are pushed away by the faith by some tragic event or something. But a lot of those people who are former Christians turn then on Christianity. I'm going to be honest. If I ever became convinced that this wasn't true, I'd spend not even one more second on this thing.
Right. Yep.
I'd move on to something else.
Yeah.
But there's this phenomenon of turning on this Christianity that you had invested so much in, that you can't seem to break away from its orbit in some way, even in attacking it, which is something that's going on too in the book itself. Is this, not only did this former professor abandon the faith, become an atheist, but he's now made a career out of attacking the faith, which is,
Yeah, and that's it's one of the things that's fascinating about the book, because it's so close to what you see just happening, and you can think of some of the prominent atheists. I won't mention any of them because I don't want to feel like I'm attacking anyone. But you think of some of the prominent atheists who have written against Christianity, and I'm with you. I'm like I wouldn't be that guy. I would just or that person that it just seems. It seems strange to me then that you would make the career, unless it's just a lucrative career. Yeah, and it's like, well, the reason I've done it is this is like, what else am I going to do?
Well, that's the story
right.
Of Michael Berg. He has made a industry out of basically attacking the faith with his book. I guess the name of the fictional book in the fictional book is When God Was Real. So he's reflecting on his journey out of the faith. But it's fun then. The computer Yar gives him, at the very beginning of their conversation, tells him he read the book and gives him a scathing review of it, saying, it was all cliche.
I wasn't convinced.
It was not. It was very poorly done, and in fact, it's a 98% chance that nobody will even be thinking about it in 5 years or whatever. I mean, just totally kind of sets up that combative dynamic. But and I guess that's me. People say, who is this Michael Berg? I made him up. He's kind of a composite. He's a little of me because I'm drawing from my experience as a professor.
Sure.
I have never abandoned the faith, but then people who have abandoned the faith, former believers. And I've read a lot of their books, and frankly, they're not great. Even when the new atheism came out of number of years back. I've grabbed, those books and said, great, something new. And
Yeah, yeah.
like, wait, no, this
This
is
is
2,000 years old. This is the same old
Yeah.
criticisms of the faith that have been going on forever. So,
Yeah.
what that tells me is it's not that somebody finds some new fact
Right.
and this, oh no, Christianity's over. It's there's other things motivating this. And we need to look at what are those other things and deal with those.
Yeah. And it does seem like maybe not a causation, but a correlation between being hurt and then turning that venom. Whereas if somebody were just to come logically with like, hey, I just don't have anything left invested in this thing at all somehow, that maybe the venom wouldn't be there. But when there is hurt involved, particularly like if emotional pain from whether it's a death of a loved one or trauma in the church or and I mean we have seen a lot of church trauma at least being brought out recently, whether it's sexual abuse, cover up of sexual abuse or even like spiritual abuse and those types of things, to where just like your mother and your brother, some people it really strengthens, which is wild to me. Like I would hope that I would be like one of those.
Right. Yep.
But some people just then turn and just have so much venom and just like, well, how can God, if this is his thing, how can he just allow this to happen?
Yeah.
And that seems to be the question. Like, so when we talk about like the problem of evil, which is, an issue
one of the
within
themes
the book.
there. Yeah.
We talk about those kinds of things. It seems to me more and more that's a lot of what comes down to people grappling wherever the question lands. It's somewhere along that spectrum or that continuum of like, what is evil? Why does this happen? How can a good God allow this to continue to happen? And the book touches on like a lot of that interplay. And so I really appreciate it. And you ask, does it read like a fiction book? And you're going, well, yes and no. I know it's a fiction book, so but it really does read in the course of things as, it reads as like this feels like real life in a lot of ways.
I've had these conversations, right?
Right.
Yeah, we've had these conversations with people.
And so was that purposeful, like in your mind? That I really want to create something that feels like it's dug into real life.
Yeah, and so throughout the thing, I like to say it's one part theology, one part story of characters and their development and their conflicts. It's one part apologetics. So there's and I had to be careful. So there's this weird, as a writer, I'm thinking, okay, I've got a computer that knows everything. I've got a former, well-trained theologian. So their conversations have to be believable.
Yeah.
But in order to do that, it's going to be like, some layperson sitting down listening to two physicists talk about their trade, right? And so I had to walk this very careful line of totally confusing the reader.
Right. Yeah.
But also, if I don't want to say dumb it down, but I guess if I simplify the conversation or short circuit it, it's not going to be believable.
Right.
So most people think I kind of pulled it off. They'd had a few conversations and take a little break. And the idea is you're supposed to be viewing this clash of titans of theological studies, etc. So there's a little bit of apologetics, and in the course of that discussion, some of these arguments, in defense of Scripture and its truthfulness, and arguments for the existence of God, and some of those things we touch upon, but it's not an apologetics book.
Right.
One of my readers said, I wish there was more apologetics in here. Well, this isn't. I'm trying to avoid taking, an apologetics textbook and just put it on the lips of these two characters.
Right.
And then it just becomes a sermon in the form of a story.
Apologetics doesn't often work that way. Like it really plays itself out in how those conversations have gone between these two characters.
Right. Yeah. And very quickly you realize, though, and this is what I'm trying to bring out, it's not just the facts on both sides.
Right. Yeah.
Which is kind of a twist toward the end. It's not just the facts of the faith that the former believer found wanting. There's more going on there.
Right.
Nor is it just the logic and rational, most likely solution to all questions that is the only thing motivating Yar, the computer. There's more going on behind the scenes. And I think that people will find that that's true to life as well. And we have to reckon with that. We're complicated beings.
Yeah.
We're not just, computers on in a skull.
As much as some of us would like to think that we are.
Yeah.
We're going to wrestle with experience, emotion, how we perceive reality,
Pain,
right,
suffering,
and some of those things don't jive with what we've come up with theologically.
Yep.
Sometimes because it's complex and there's no easy answer to some of that stuff. Like when we talk about at the beginning, just falling away from the faith, and even like I don't know if there's better language to use for that. To understand what's going on there, because from a practical level, from our perception, that's exactly what it looks like.
Yeah.
And so, but that might not be the thing that's going on.
Yeah.
And so, how we perceive and understand those things on a practical level can be different and separated from like what we're going to talk about on a more academic or scholarly level of these things. And so, I thought you pulled it off. And so, we had a conversation about the book before I read it, and so I was really going to be like, I wonder if he pulled some of this stuff off, and I thought you did.
Yeah.
And listening to it, like when you said it, it would be like listening to a conversation of physicists. And we had another professor of theology on the show, and like this show is meant to be like very casual, and but as soon as you start talking about theological issues. We have our own language, and we talk about things like, well, how else do you talk about these things? It would be like the medical profession trying to explain medical procedures without using any technical language. It's almost impossible.
Yeah.
And but the book itself didn't read like that. It didn't read like an apologetics textbook that was just like shoved into the mouths of two characters. And so
there's a question very early on, I think in the first or second chapter, where when Michael Berg is invited to come and talk to this, engage his computer, he asks Rami, who's the creator of the thing, is Yar really sentient?
Right.
Or is that just a marketing, ploy? And it's interesting because the way I write it, you can kind of tell Rami himself isn't exactly sure.
Yeah.
He pauses and he says, he thinks he's sentient.
Yeah.
And what does that mean? Does that mean? And so when you get into the room with them, and I actually, one of the decisions I made, and I think I made the right decision, I waited, I think you're about 8 or 9 chapters into the thing before finally the computer is introduced. So I kind of building this tension, and finally you get to meet this thing.
Yeah.
What's he going to be like? And some of my readers have described him as charming. They wanted more, to hear from him more. He was kind of likable, but at the same time, sometimes rational to a fault. Like they talk about, his solutions for solving homelessness in America.
Right.
He presented these to his owner, he's solved it. There's these 6 solutions, and off, in another scene, Rami says, half of them make him a Marxist and the other half make him a fascist, know. They're politically unsatisfying. But, in the computer's mind, he's like, no, these'll do the trick.
Right.
Yeah. But at the same time, there's a question, does he feel? Does he have emotion?
Right.
Where is he? And I leave that question kind of unanswered.
It's
you
vague.
Have to kind of decide.
You have to dig in a little bit to go, like where is it going? Because it does leave it really open to some interpretation of why he's saying some of the things that he's saying. How did he get to some of these things? I mean, frankly, early in the book, why has he come to the conclusion of Christianity? Like, why did he start searching about that kind of stuff? And so it's not giving anything away, but it is interesting because you kind of answer that. Well, you don't kind of. You answer the question at the end of the book that there was a reason, there was a purpose that he starts to formulate these things.
Yeah, that's in a typical story. There's something they call a MacGuffin. It's the thing, the prize that the main character is trying to get. Sometimes it's an actual thing, like in Indiana Jones, the Ark of the Covenant or whatever. But oftentimes it's this thing that they're trying to discover or achieve. In this case, it is this obsession, this computer's sudden obsession over religious and theological things. Even after they reboot him, he keeps going back to this, and he can't stop. He's obsessing over it, and why now, and why can't we stop him from obsessing over this? And so what is basically motivating his pursuit of spiritual things? Which, again, I mean, Yar, it's an interesting take. Yar is a computer, but Yar is a stand in for us.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes we're very rational to the point of hurting people's feelings. Sometimes we're very emotional to the point where we just throw out, you know, what we seem to know to be true. And I think, and in that sense, maybe I've answered my question. Maybe Yar really is a sentient being.
And I'm just kind of putting this together now, that there's a reason that Yar has started this path of trying to understand Christianity, and there's a reason then that Michael Berg has stepped away from it, and this is life. Like we talk about this being so complicated.
I do set up Yar and Dr. Berg, Mike, and these two kind of totally polar opposite, atheism or theism and atheism, and rational, and I think it'd be fair to say. Correct me if you think I'm misinterpreting my own story here, but it just kind of struck me that at some point in the story, they intersect.
Yes.
They kind of suddenly are standing in the same spot.
Right.
And you realize that, oh my gosh, how complicated is this? That similar kind of a pivot point has resulted in totally opposite.
Yeah. Exactly.
Outcomes.
Exactly.
You know?
Yeah, that's what I was getting at.
Like my mom and my uncle, you know, it's just a totally different.
Right.
And then, you know, I do leave the resolution kind of out there.
Yeah. It's open for interpretation.
Yeah, I think I mentioned to you before the program started. There was actually another chapter. There's a missing
now I'm all
chapter,
excited
right?
for this.
There's a missing chapter that ends it a little different way. And it's not that I changed the ending per se, but by cutting the ending, I've left questions on purpose sort of unanswered, like what exactly happens to these three characters, etc. And one of my first readers, you know, and when it was still in kind of first draft form, loved it and said it was great, dialogue was excellent, cut the last chapter. And I said, "Are you sure?" Because I really loved that last chapter. Worked so hard on it. And then I looked at that thing and I thought, you know what, he's right. Because it's, I guess it was too hallmarky, you know. Everything ends up, you know, the orchestra flourishes and everything. And I thought, you know, that's not real life. Sometimes you don't know. And I wanted the idea that their journey. So I know kind of what ultimately happens because I still think that's the official reality behind the story. But I don't really reveal that.
And see, now what you can do is write 4 or 5 different tracks along the ending. Make it like some kind of electronic book.
Choose your own adventure, right? Yeah.
But yeah, when you told me that, I was like, yeah, I'd be really interested. So part of me would want to read that chapter. The other part of me doesn't.
Yeah, right.
Because I do have my own, like, well, I know real life experience on several sides of this thing, and so I thought it was great when it ended. I wanted more because I like the story, so I wanted more.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I was going, yeah, that's actually a really kind of real place to end it, and so it was like.
Yeah, and I think it's you know, it's a novella size, a little longer than a short story, but much shorter than a novel, which is a very awkward size. You just get started reading it and it's over, but it does form a very compact arc.
Yeah.
And I think if it was any longer, it'd be filled with fluff.
Right.
If it was any shorter, I wouldn't be able to. But a lot of people have said, you know, they like the characters, they wish they kind of could have more, but you know, I just don't see where else the story can go without getting.
Yeah, I mean, obviously
silly,
you could
you know?
develop like, well, I don't want to give anything away, but there are other relationships that are just kind of brought up quickly.
Yeah.
And so like, obviously those could be developed, but I don't know how much more they would contribute to the story. So I thought it was great, and it's really accessible. So, you know, sometimes you're reading a book and like, especially if you don't have a lot of time, but you want to read a book. And so you get through it and you're like, okay, so I'm going to read a chapter. But the chapter ends up being like 40 pages. And you're like, oh my goodness, I can't get to do through that chapter. But these were really like maybe 5 or 6 pages per chapter or so.
Less, probably. Yeah.
And so it was really like, if that's what you're going to do, like I would think I would have a hard time putting it there. I read it in 2 hours.
Yeah.
And
most people say about 2 hours,
yeah.
2-3 hours if you.
And I was enjoying it, like I was having coffee, and so it wasn't like rushing through it or anything.
Yeah.
And I'm not all that fast of a reader. And so So it was good. It was very accessible, and it's very practical, I think, in a lot of ways, and people can start to see their questions kind of forming and like, oh, I'm not alone in this thing.
Yeah, I've actually thought this would make a good, if I were ever part of a reading group or a book club or something, it would be a fun read for a book club, because one of the great things about getting through it within about 2 hours is most of the people actually do the reading for that week. And,
Right.
they don't have much of an excuse when you're dealing with a big, thick book like that. That might be a little more challenging for some. But it also, I think, almost every chapter brings up some of these questions that can springboard into questions of faith and doubt and pain, and how rational is this? How rational does this faith need to be for me to embrace it? Or can we continue on? I think it's just, and then the even questions about AI in general, which is out there in the news all the time. People are, ever since I wrote this, people are kind of forwarding or posting things about AI to me, like, look what's happening now. And I'm fascinated by, I had a couple of computer scientists say, or computer experts say that my treatment of the technology and the science behind AI was good in here. That I treated it well.
Okay.
I did some crash course research on the internet and just talked about it enough to fake it. And I had the luxury of having, the computer expert in the story, and then you got the theologian who's from his perspective.
Yeah.
And so he could always say, pretend I'm stupid, know. That was my excuse to be able to dumb it down. So it was that was one of the things that was the biggest challenge, in writing it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm no computer expert. I like to think I'm dangerous enough because I'm not like totally inept when it comes to technology and stuff. And I am fascinated by the whole AI movement. I'm not quite scared of it.
Yeah.
To me, like these things are like anything that we can create, and we were created to be creative beings and designed to do that. And so I'm not scared if we make things that are creative as well. Like this just seems to be, but like with everything, we can start worshiping the creation rather than the creator who is blessed for eternity. Amen. And but this is the issue, I think, with a lot of this kind of stuff. And so it did pique my interest on like, how far is this thing going to go in the book? And
that actually comes up too. And there's they talk about, going Skynet, from Terminator. And that becomes kind of this theme
kind
that
of
keeps
comical,
coming up. How
like,
can we keep you from going
Yeah.
And, he actually is, Michael Berg actually asks Yar the question, what does keep you from, taking the path of
right.
And, so I talk about Isaac Asimov's laws of robotics, which has become a trope in sci-fi since he came up with it, that's supposed to keep creating synthetic intelligences from actually killing people. But then he brings up, plus God would not like this. This is against God.
Right.
This is life is so he's bringing in the fact that that this computer system is a believer, believes that there's a higher power that is greater than him, and that humans were created in his image, and to do so would be an offense to this Almighty. And then he turns and he says, "Well, it's keeping you from becoming evil."
Yeah.
You
have the capability more than I do. At least
I have a pretty good track record here, and you all humans don't. What about you? What's holding you back from becoming a monster? And it doesn't really answer that question, but it's a fair question.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. We're really scared of technology taking over and doing all this like crazy stuff when like we're guilty of all the stuff that we're scared of it taking over and doing.
Yeah.
Which becomes a problem in us. And you as you were talking, I was thinking more about like the storyline, what's going on in the book. One of the things, actually two things, but I'll mention one of them first because I have to start somewhere. That's how that works.
Yeah.
There was this, I can't remember the quote. I'm terrible at like word for word
paraphrase.
But it was like apologetics is the salve for the believer in what they believe.
Yeah.
But it's the wound for those who don't believe in some way. Something along that line, right?
Yeah. So, that was I stole that unashamedly from Dr. Doug Blunt. I don't know if you remember Doug back at DTS, philosopher. professional philosopher. He in his class used this illustration, and I acknowledged it in the back of the acknowledgement, so I didn't rip him off. You can't footnote a fiction book, but that was the best I could do. He basically says apologetics, typical apologetics, he uses the illustration of a greasy taco and Tums.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
And so the same apologetics is supposed to be a greasy taco for the atheist to get them queasy about their atheism.
Right.
And then it's supposed to be the Tums, the antacid for the believer to make them to help them when they become queasy about their belief in God, right? And and it's a great illustration because it acknowledges that both of those positions are subject to doubt. Doubting atheism, maybe I've going too far on this, or doubting the faith. And so apologetics, it's for the believer and for the unbeliever. The very same argument can strengthen the faith of a believer and weaken the quote unquote faith of the lack of faith of the unbeliever. So yeah.
Yeah, and that was the other concept actually that I was going to mention is this idea of doubting doubt. Mm-hmm. And that goes both ways as well, I think. And you don't see that so much on Yar. Like he's not doubting what he has come to believe is true. But you do see that in Michael Berg of this interplay as he's going, when they come together in some ways of like doubting what he has now doubted, and coming to the place of just doubting unbelief in some sense, which was interesting to me. I mean, I was hoping that this would play in some way where he's theological professor and believed devoted his life to this pursuit of God and Christ and all of this, and then stepping away from that to actually not just stepping away but being totally opposed and enemy of and then starting to maybe hedge on doubting that doubt of whether God exists at all or not or something. And so I enjoyed the interplay of that tension that you created in that to where, and even with Rami, the agnostic who, with agnostics, to me, you always have this kind of it could be true, that could be true, but this could be too.
He's very pragmatic.
Right.
He actually at one point says, I honestly don't care what Yar believes. I believe in freedom of religion for humans and for AI. I just don't want it to affect his performance, which I actually kind of stole, and I mentioned this in another podcast at one point, but I actually kind of stole that idea from, I know this guy who is a Christian and he's deep in Hollywood, and I one time over dinner had this conversation, and I said, what's that like being a Christian in Hollywood? He said, you know what? They don't care. Nobody cares what you believe as long as you don't mess up the production. Because we're on a tight schedule. It's really expensive. As soon as your beliefs, whether that's Christianity or Scientology or Buddhism or whatever, as long as it starts messing up, because of relationship conflicts or slowing things down or you need a day off, whatever, that's when they start not liking your religion. They don't care what you believe. That was his perspective. I don't know if that's everybody's experience, but that was his experience. So I thought when Rami is there, he doesn't care what Yar believes as long as it doesn't mess up the performance, and that's what it's doing.
And
so he wants a solution.
Right.
He says, I don't care I don't need you to talk him out of religion. Just stop him from being such a zealot,
Right, yeah.
Which is kind of a fun take. I going back, I guess if I were to add anything, I would love to see a little bit more of, Rami's character developed, because I only got to know him a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, as I said, there are things that could be expounded in the book, but it's really accessible. And again, I agree with you. This could be really good for a book club. So here, I was asked by a few people that wanted to do a book club, and I was like, and they were telling me kind of what they were interested in, and I said, why not read Surprised by Hope? And one of my favorite books, honestly, and so they did. Because to me, that's very accessible. N.T. Wright has a way of writing, very scholarly.
Even if you don't like anything he says it so well.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
And then if you listen to him, he has that English accent, and it's just pleasing and soothing, even if he's criticizing everything that you believe.
Exactly.
but it's a book that brings up a lot of things that
discuss,
like
yeah.
I think people are wrestling with, even if they don't know that they're wrestling with it or should wrestle with it. And but I had people tell me, well, it was a little technical. I was like,
okay.
oh man.
Yeah, where do you go from there?
Right.
Yeah.
And so, because that to me is like one of his really accessible
Yeah,
works. And he
it
has
is.
a great job of explaining really complex things in like lay language. And
Yeah.
I don't possess that skill all that well. And maybe that's just,
Yeah. Well, that's the one thing about fiction. People wonder why I do fiction, and it is because you can, I call it theologically infused
yeah.
storytelling,
Yeah.
which is, it's not a sermon put on the lips of these characters. I try to avoid that. I don't
Right.
like that kind of Christian fiction, but it really is, it brings up those things in a very accessible way.
Right.
So that's why I say as a book club or small group kind of read, people say, well, we can't read fiction for a Christian book club or whatever. Yeah, it's fiction, but it's there we go, theologically infused fiction.
Yeah. Yeah. And,
I
and
do the
it's
same thing.
practical theology.
I do the same thing in in all my fiction. Frankly, none of it's not Christian fiction, but the novel Topia, and I'm almost finished with the sequel to that.
Which now I have to go back and
yeah,
read
well,
because I enjoyed this one. So thank
it's
you
a different
for that.
pace, different kind of style, but it's an alternate history kind of thing, and takes place in an alternate future, and a lot of things going on. But it's a lot of theology, a lot of philosophy going on there, a lot of kind of metaphors and allegories and things going on for Christianity, even though it's not, it's not Christian. I guess it's Christian. I don't know how to describe it. I've had interviews with people about Christians writing fiction and how Christian does it need to be, and can you have your characters cuss in it? Can they? Can
it
they
be real life Christian?
Right, right. Yeah, right. So it is a difficult balance. But one thing I always want to do is make sure that it is advancing in some way or illuminating our worldview, and so people come away from it with some feeling like they've learned something or experienced something that helps their faith.
And I think that's the great thing about the accessibility of it, because when you read this, you'll start to, especially if you're not like overly familiar with all these great theological notions that are like implicit, and some of them explicit, but some of them really implicit, that you're gonna feel like, I've had these same questions that they're talking about, and some of those questions have actually come from my lips. And I've actually had people then ask me those questions. So I've heard them in my ears as well now. And, as Christians, I think what's happened just with us is, for the most of us, especially the laity, we've lost the art of apologetics that we don't know how to talk about the faith anymore. And not even like...
Or afraid to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The boldness is like on the low end of the continuum now. But even if we maybe were more bold, and the internet is great because you get to watch everybody who videotapes themselves doing anything, and I'm seeing like people, and I don't want to be too critical because they're doing things that I'm not doing, and even if I want to criticize that,
Yeah, right.
but I'm going like, ooh, that's not good, like, and how that's being spoken about, and how we're, and so like I don't know what that is, but here you have like a theological professor who knows what he's talking about, battling, so to speak, this sentient, maybe possibly sentient computer of who knows how to talk about it,
right.
but in a way that's not even on the technical level of the professor in some ways, but really practical. And so I think that's going to be accessible for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And I'll I was thinking through, because we talked about whether to like maybe a book club or something like that. And I actually think that's a great idea because I think it'll bring up a lot of the issues at hand that people are asking, whether they know they're asking that question, but that will connect and go, oh, wait, that's actually the question I'm asking.
Yeah.
And so, I appreciated that to where it could be used not just as, okay, well, that was fun.
Entertainment.
And like,
it's not just entertainment. I guess that's going back to how I rambled before. That's what I'm going for. I want it to be entertaining.
Sure. Yeah.
But I don't want it to be entertainment.
Right.
There's a difference there.
There is a difference, yeah.
And I want it to be, we all know the difference, when you watch a movie, you're like, that was dumb, but it was entertaining, mindless. And then you watch another movie and you're like, that was not only enjoyable, but man, I can't stop thinking about it. That's what I'm going for.
Yeah.
I want to keep thinking about this.
Yeah, and I think you accomplished it for what my opinion matters. It's been a long time since I've read fiction, so I enjoyed it, and it was one that now, I've got to, it was well written. And I'm not just saying that. So now I want to go back and read like Topia.
Yeah.
I can be excited that the part 2 or whatever.
Yeah,
is,
Elegy is the name of it.
Okay.
It should be out early January, but we'll
Nice.
see. We'll
Okay.
see.
Yeah.
I'm on. That's the good thing is I'm working on nonfiction stuff right now. I have publisher waiting for a manuscript on something I'm working on, and so I do this kind of thing to relax, on the side.
Nice.
So fiction's not my main thing. Even though you said thank you for saying you thought it was well written, a lot of people have. They said, yeah, I bought this really skeptical because the reality is most people who write technical theological stuff don't do fiction. But my story is I actually came at this the other way. I started out back in high school and college studying literature and fiction, and actually had a course on science fiction back in college, and and then moved into theological studies and writing.
Okay.
So I'm more originally trained
Okay.
in creative writing, fiction writing. So that explains that. Not everybody does it, but
Right.
it's a little weird background there.
So I don't want to keep you for too long.
Nope. Yeah, we're good.
But I do, at least for our audience sake,
Mm-hmm.
and to like expose some of your work.
Mm.
Can you just talk about some of your other works?
Sure.
That if somebody reads this and they're going, oh, well, I'd like to explore maybe more of the theology
Of the nonfiction stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. Very quickly, I'll just kind of mention a few titles that people might like. Of course, I have really technical stuff that I'm not going to recommend, but probably one of the more popular things has been my one I co-wrote with John Adair, Dr. Adair at Dallas Seminary. It's called Urban Legends of Church History.
Great book.
Yeah, and
Love
it's
it.
40 myths of church history that people believe and teach and I hear it all the time. And it kind of goes through each of those and dispels the myths. It's like myth busting for church history.
Yeah.
Then there's the Exploring Christian Theology trilogy, which is
Yes.
actually corporately authored by the whole Department of Theological Studies, and it's written at a very lay-friendly level. It's all of the areas of theology, 3 volumes. That has been really well received, and it's what I like about it is it's neutral theology, meaning we focus heavily on the things all Christians agree on, but also point out some of the differences without necessarily making those decisions for the reader.
Right.
And then Retro Christianity now is over 10 years old, but that's kind of my book on church and the spiritual life, kind of retrieving some things from the early church. So those would be my main kind of books out there that I would recommend.
Yeah. You mentioned the trilogy Exploring, and like we had to read those.
Yeah.
But they are like very, again, accessible works to where I think anybody who reads the AItheist and is like thinking through some of the stuff that's like in there, that those would be really great works to start with, and that I think they can understand, because y'all explain the theological language and what, like, again, just you're gonna have technical language when you're into a discipline. Like every discipline has its own language, and so but it does become really explained, and there's a dictionary in the back of each one that's going to explain.
That's right.
It's not like exhaustive, but it's
for
concise.
that particular book. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so yeah, if anybody's listening and cares about my opinion, those would be great. And I've recommended those books to a lot of people.
Yeah, and all of those books you can get on Amazon. I'm with a name like Svigel, it's both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing in that you Google Svigel and I'm going to pop up, basically. Right. It's not, if you ever meet another Svigel, I'm related to them. Truly. But, the curse is how do you pronounce this thing?
Right.
What is that? Never heard of such a thing. So it's a weird name. But yeah, you can just go to Amazon, just type in Svigel, and you can get any of those.
Yeah, and I'll put some
books
links.
there.
I'll put links
it's
in
really
the
easy to find.
in the podcast description and stuff
Yeah.
as well, so that and I'll even put your technical works there because we
Okay.
have people that listen from
Sure,
all over
sure.
the spectrum, and so I'll put them there because you have some that are intriguing to me now, and that are coming out, have just come out, and so without taking time to talk about those, I'll put those links there as well, and that way people can be more exposed to your writing. That Retro Christianity for me, I read it later, or at least later in my seminary career, but it was one of those that I was just like, yeah, this is this is really important for a lot of people to read, and how we just kind of like move away from everything that's been in the past. And the church, I mean, yeah, the Mythbusters book was great as well.
Yeah, it's a fun one.
Yeah, I bet it was. I was actually, so right when I met Dr. Adair, we had coffee, and he was working on it.
Okay,
and so we were talking. I felt like I had an inside scoop a little bit of what he was working on as he was writing his part of the book or whatever. And so I waited for it to come out, and I was like, yeah, it was everything I expected it to be from that conversation. So yeah, those I'm glad that you mentioned each one of those titles, because I think they're beneficial for people, and they're written on a really I don't want to say lay level and make it be like, well, there's nothing technical in it.
Right.
But it is, I don't have a better word than just it's accessible for people who aren't theologically trained so much that they can start down like some more theological understanding without being like, well, this is a physicist has written this book. And like going back to the conversation that I had with another professor of theology, I thought it was very lay level conversation that we had on the podcast.
Yeah,
and it was to me, it was like theology 101.
Yeah,
and
it's good.
And then but that was the exact comment I got, that I had to listen to it 6 times. Somebody told me I had to listen to it 6 times because it was like listening to 2 physicists.
Oh.
And I was like,
hopefully our discussion about a fiction book is not going to be that difficult.
Yeah, I don't think so, but hopefully not. And so, hey, I really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thanks so much.
And fun. I'll have to thank my friend for like, you gotta meet Svigel, because I'm so glad that I did and that we've had this conversation. And I hope that we can have more of these. Yeah, thanks so much.
The sun pulls a shadow across the sky in shades of pink and gold. I feel the wind as it moves across my face. You touch upon my soul. A portrait painted by an unseen hand, a hand that always shows that though you're not seen standing next to me, deep inside I know. Well, I know you're here with me. And in my head again, I see you smile, something like sunshine pouring down. And in my head again, I see you smile. Moving down this road of sweat and tears, it's comforting to know that my lover's always near, watching as I go. And in the beauty of the river's edge, the crashing of the sea, create